welcome Dr. Jon Erickson.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. I appreciate it. Gabriella and I exchanged some emails a few weeks back, and she said that you were at the point in the class where you're really looking at policy and policy design. And I know you're using the Daly and Varley textbook, and you've looked at some of the principles for policy design. So we thought, as a complement to that, I could discuss some of the so-called leverage points that are often used in systems thinking, dynamic systems modeling in particular. And I borrow these quite liberally from Donella Meadows. If you don't know Meadows' work, she was a systems theorist or a systems modeler. She really, her work dates back to the late 60s, early 1970s, and she was part of a team, really the lead of a team that published the Limits to Growth study. This was a study that was commissioned by the Club of Rome. It was published in the Limits to Growth book in 1972. And it partnered with Jay Forrester, Dennis Meadow, her husband at the time, a number of systems modelers that were using the then kind of emergent power of computers to try to understand complex interactions between economies, society, and environment and resources, and to ask some very difficult questions around what are the limits to growth, and what are the drivers of growth, population growth, economic growth, technological change. What are the limits both on the social side and on the resource side and ultimately on the environmental side? And it turned out to be a very, very prophetic study that really, I think, was way ahead of its time and sort of coming to terms with those limits. In fact, many of the predictions of the book indeed have come true, not so much on the resource side because of technological advances. That was most of the attention of the book was given to the resource limits. But on the environmental side, certainly in terms of things like greenhouse gas pollution and nutrient pollution, but also on the social limits to growth, which is an often overlooked part of that book. So Dana Meadows was part of that team, and she's also was a professor at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. There is an institute, the Donella Meadows Institute now, that was created in her honor. And kind of her legacy lives on in a lot of the systems work that we all do now in a field called ecological economics. So the article that I'm drawing from, we can send around a link to this. It's based on a kind of eureka moment that Dana Meadows had when she was part of a group that was looking very critically at free trade agreements, NAFTA, GATT, WTO. And she kind of had this epiphany during one of these sort of international meetings that were discussing free trade agreements, that the world was designing these new systems but had really no idea how to control them once the proverbial cat was let out of the bag, right? How could we possibly control these new systems? And the context, of course, was looking at the environmental impacts and the labor impacts and the social impacts of these new free trade agreements. And even the kind of most liberally minded people who were trying to write in controls to the potential downsides of this were adding parameters and controls that were just minuscule as compared to the enormous transformative change that these free trade agreements were gonna bring to bear. And so during this meeting, she, as I said, kind of had this epiphany and stood up, and the story goes, ran to a flip chart and started to write out kind of a David Letterman style top 10 list, right, of what are the major leverage points? What are the major ones from the least impactful to the most impactful ways to change, direct, control complex systems? And we thought that I could maybe share some of those leverage points with you today in a discussion about complex systems that would link nicely to the discussions you've been having around policy design. So that's my starting point. We think about in ecological economics, as you've learned in this class, about nested systems, right? I mean, this is the kind of paradigm shift of ecological economics, that we need to embed the study of the economy within the study of social and cultural systems, within the study of the containing, sustaining ecosystems. And I'm sure from Daly and Farley you've seen the circle and square diagrams, right? And it's really quite intuitive, I think, if you've had any natural science background, that of course we would embed this system, this physical system called the economy, within the containing, sustaining ecosystem. Systems dynamics as a discipline, as a modeling technique, really helps us understand these interrelationships between stocks, flows, levels, parameters. And it really is nothing more than these, what are sometimes called bathtub models. There's some sort of level or parameter or some state of a system that you want to keep track of. They're called a bathtub model because sometimes the easiest way to visualize this is water in a bathtub. And there's inflows and outflows. And just with a very simple visual language, we can describe very, 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 very complex systems through boxes and squares and circles. There's different rates of change of these inflows and outflows. And then there's different parameters that affect these rates of change. And we could start with thinking about your bathtub and the faucet pouring water in and the drain taking water out. And then if we wanted to, we could connect the water source to your local municipal water source and then connect that out to complex local watershed dynamics and hydrologies and connect that out to the global water systems. And you can imagine you could quickly get what are sometimes called spaghetti diagrams, right? Big, complex sort of understanding that started with your own bathtub and maybe reached out to the hydrological cycles of the Earth system. What we often do with these systems models, from the very simple ones to the more complex ones, is we try to understand a perceived state, right? And of course, in your own bathtub, that's easy. You look in and you see how much water is in the bathtub. And you also, but you want a goal state, right? You want in the case of your bathtub, you want a certain level before you take a bath. And there's some discrepancy between the perceived state and the goal state. And we measure that discrepancy by looking at the difference between inflows and outflows. It could be the same with the temperature of the bath, right? You have a temperature is your state. You have a desired temperature. You have a goal. You know what the temperature is by dipping your toe in the water, and you can control the inflows and outflows, in this case, of both the hot water and cold water spigots. This kind of very simplistic way of thinking about dynamic change in the world can lead you to very, very complex and very insightful intuitions about how systems work and where the leverage points in those systems are. Does anyone want to help me define leverage point? What do I mean by leverage point? Have you heard that used before?
Something you can tweak to get something else moving?
Yeah, it's usually thought of as some small change that you can make that really affects change throughout the entire system, right? And the really effective, maybe you've heard the expression, give me a lever long enough and I can change the whole world, right? So it's that notion of leverage from physics. And a leverage point, sometimes they're called tipping points. There was a popular book by Malcolm Gladwell called Tipping Point that went through and looked at different kinds of just small, and very often they're not really intuitive, right? They're things that you wouldn't expect that could really make massive changes throughout a system. And that's what we mean by leverage points. And sometimes we draw systems diagrams, and sometimes we actually parameterize these system diagrams and run complex computer models like the world model that was done for the limits of growth study to understand where are those sort of points of leverage. Where can we make big changes in a system, sometimes with very, 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 very little effort. And so, through Meadows, her top list. And she started with 9, and she eventually expanded it to 12. So I'll use the full list to kind of get a sense of what I mean by leverage points when we think about these systems. And we'll start with kind of, they're all impactful, okay? They all can make change in a system. But we'll start with Dana's list from the least impactful to the most impactful. And they all interrelate with one another as well. But we'll start with number 12. And these are really the parameters in the system. These are the constants, the numbers. If you're thinking about an economic system, the level of a subsidy, the level of a tax, standards. These are the things that we absolutely obsess about in policy discussions. What should the debt level be? What should the interest rate be? What should be the ambient air quality standard? What should be the allowable cut or the allowable catch? What should be the minimum wage? Where should the poverty line be? Right? It's sort of like accepting the system, accepting the structure of the system, and just playing around with the numbers. And of course, I mean, that's what we do. That's like what 99% of policy is tweaking the numbers, tweaking the parameters. And these are very impactful levers that we have, but they often, for them to have a higher level impact, they often depend on things further down the list. You know, once these kinds of changes are implemented, yeah, we see change, but we often don't get the change we want, or as fast as we want, or as much as we want. So you pass a new law that sort of puts limits on campaign contributions in politics. Does that get rid of corruption in politics? You find new ways around them, and you accept the structure, right? That money should be in politics, and you just go and change the parameters. Interest rate policy, you know, interest rate policy we absolutely obsess about, but it doesn't really change the business cycle, right? Which is what we're using it to kind of control. We spend more money on police, or more money on health, or more money on this and that, and yet we still have kind of the fundamental root causes of the problems that we're spending money on. So that's the idea of parameters. More effective still is the size of buffers. Now we're getting more to some of the structure of the system. The size of buffers or other stabilizing stocks relative to their flows. So if you know, this gets us into conversations when we think about complex systems about, for example, deeper soils, deeper soil horizons provide great buffers for acid deposition, right? When you think about flooding in communities, you don't often hear about lakes flooding, but you hear about rivers flooding all the time, right? Because it has to do with the size of the buffer. If you flood a lake, it's often a huge, huge event. When we talk about biodiversity protection or endangered species laws, we want to sort of have minimum viable population sizes, breeding population sizes, right? But to get off the minimum and get into bigger and bigger and bigger minimum, bigger breeding populations, that's a bigger buffer, and it buffers that species or that particular part of biodiversity, buffers it from change the larger that population is. Right? So it's kind of intuitive, right? If we have larger buffers, and often buffers mean putting assets into kind of assets on the table that we might not be using, we can create more resilient systems. We can create systems that can take impact in a smoother, better way. So buffers are a big part of a big leverage of what we think about in complex dynamic systems. Getting farther into the structure of the systems as well is the structure of material stocks and flows. So when we play around with the parameters, or when we expand the size of the bathtub, right? That's sort of one way, one leverage point in the system. But when we start to think about the underlying structure, the arrows, the length of the arrows, the impacts of the arrows, the connections of flow rates to other levels, we're getting into a higher point of leverage, the very structure of the system itself, right? We could spend a lot of money taxing energy or subsidizing renewables, or we could go in and change the structure of the system through huge energy efficiency improvements, for example, right? Building size, passive solar, design of our transportation systems, design of where we work and where we play and where we live. These are the structures of the systems themselves that you can change the parameters, or you can really think about the design of the system itself. Traffic design, traffic networks is certainly a classic example. In Portland, Oregon, when they decided to control sprawl, control growth of their city by starting to plan hubs for public transportation and then plan concentrated housing around those hubs, they built a public transportation system that actually worked, that people used, versus jumping in your car, right? But it took sort of planning the structure of that system and some foresight on that, versus your typical solution to traffic, at least in the US, is accept the structure as is, just add another lane, right? Get traffic, add another lane, add another lane, add another lane. And then pretty soon you're reinforcing the whole problem in the system to begin with. You're letting people live farther away from the city, live farther away from work by adding another lane. Population age structure is a really important aspect of the structure of systems when we think about population change. Typically 17-year-olds turn into 18-year-olds, and 18-year-olds turn into 19-year-olds, and 19 to 20, right? So understanding population structure is a really important part about the material stocks and flows of a system. These are hugely influential, but they're really hard to change, especially once they're already put in place, right? Once you build a town, once you build a community, once you build a building, once you structure an age structure for population, they're really hard to change. So this is why Meadows put this sort of farther down the list. Even though they're hugely impactful, they're very difficult to change. We're in a big debate in Vermont right now about the structure of the fossil fuel economy, right? How much are we going to buy into the fossil fuel economy, or to what extent are we going to start to make the change that needs to happen that really won't pay off for 20, 30, or 40 years down the road? In Vermont, we've banned fracking of natural gas in Vermont, yet we freely accept fracked gas from Canada. So that's a problem, right? And now we're talking about expanding a gas pipeline into Vermont from Canada. And a lot of people are saying, enough's enough. We've got to start to change the structure of the system and make it favorable for renewables. And the more you expand the straw, right, from Canada, the more we're going to get addicted and bought into and locked into a fossil fuel economy.
Which pipeline is this?
It's a pipeline that comes from Quebec down just on the sort of northwest corner of Vermont. Yep. Vermont Gas, which is our natural gas company, but it's owned by Gas Metro, which is a Canadian company, and gas politics are alive and well in Vermont, for sure. Farther down the list, getting to more impactful leverage points, right? Lengths of delays. Here we're getting into the sort of structure of the system. Now we're starting to get more into the information in the system. The length of delays relative to the rate of system changes. So, to stick with my sort of bathroom example, right? If you've got a really poorly designed hot water system, maybe some of you have been, maybe your own apartments, or maybe you've been to a hotel where you turn the hot water and then you wait, and then it's really hard to get the right temperature, right? It's really hard to get the right level. And you have these, and if you're taking a bath, it's a little easier to get the right level than if you're taking a shower. Why? Because showers don't have a buffer, right? So you're standing in there, you're getting the instant sort of scalding effect of a delay in the system. Shortening those delays can help us really achieve those perceived or the goal states that we want. Limiting overshoot and undershoot cycles is what I'm talking about by limiting the length of delays. To stick with an energy example, centralized energy supply systems where you plan for years, build a big, huge power plant that then lasts for 30, 40, 50 years, right, is a way different kind of model than decentralized, small-scale, regional hub kinds of energy systems, which we're moving more and more towards in Vermont. They tend to be models where we have to build a lot of overcapacity because the delays in the system are so long. We realize, oh, we need more energy, time to plan for another big, huge plant, 3-year planning process, 5-year construction phase, then it comes online, then we've got it for 30 years, right? We're seeing a movement, for example, to smart meters, where the grid is becoming way more integrated, and the level of household power and consumption is much more planned. Electrification of the grid, electrification of vehicle fleets, where we're going to be starting to think about our cars as our energy storage that get charged at night and maybe feed back into the grid during the day, these kinds of arrangements. Slowing economic growth is a huge leverage point when we think about these delays. If you slow growth, then the technological things can keep up, the price adjustments can keep up, versus really rapidly growing economies tend to boom bust, right? Tend to overshoot and collapse. And it's all about those delays. These shortening delays, shortening times can also work in the wrong way. I think about the transaction time now with financial transactions on Wall Street. They've become so short that they've contributed to this real sensitive, very fragile nature of our financial systems, where the shortening of the delay can contribute to booms and busts within financial systems. The internet, the 24-hour news cycle, these are great things, but when you think about how fast we get information now, they often can contribute to overreaction, underreaction kind of cycles. So it really cuts both ways. How are we doing? What time did we go to?
We 6:45.
6:45. Okay.
Yes, so we have that.
Okay. Any questions so far? I'm just going to this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through these leverage points. And if you've got examples, you should shout them out. All right. Let me get to a few more down the list here. Let's go to number 8. Doesn't this feels like a David Letterman kind of top 10 thing? No? 8. Strength of the negative feedbacks, or the negative feedback loops. In complex systems, we think about feedback loops. There are negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. Negative feedback loop, someone want to help me out? Give me an example or define it. Think of a negative feedback loop. I'll give you a multiple choice. Is a negative feedback loop self-correcting or self-reinforcing?
Self-correcting.
Self-correcting, good. So a negative feedback loop, a classic example is a thermostat, right? So you set the goal, the temperature of the room or the house, and if it's colder outside, then the temperature drops and the heat turns on back up to the temperature, and then the heater turns off. Or if it's too hot outside, the temperature raises, the air conditioner comes on, brings it back down. So it's a self-correcting mechanism, right? A negative feedback loop. There are all kinds of feedback loops. And some of them are just kind of in the background, waiting to be used, waiting to control the system if needed. So Meadows gives the example of an emergency cooling system in a nuclear power plant, right? It's really important to build in feedback loops, even if you don't need them, right? Because they can really control the system. So you'd hate to not have that emergency cooling system when you actually need it. The body's ability to sweat is another classic example, right? We don't always need to sweat, but you have this feedback system built into your own plumbing, your own structure that helps you control your body's temperature. These are negative feedback loops, and sometimes they're redundant, and sometimes that's good when we think about leverage and how to control a system. They're very important to maintain. In economics, the price mechanism, markets, are really powerful negative feedback systems, right? You guys have learned about demand and supply, and X marks the spot, and excess supply, excess demand, and what makes prices goes up and what makes prices go down, all without the control of some central authority, right? I mean, that's sort of the beauty and the brilliance of markets, right? Is that they are a negative feedback loop system. And the narrative in economics is keep your hands out of them and let them do their own thing. Let them respond to people's preferences on the demand side, technology and supply and resources on the supply side. And so we often hear about ways to control complex systems or ways to make sure that negative feedback loops are strengthened relative to the impact that they're trying to control. So to stick with the market example, antitrust laws are ways to kind of keep markets doing what they're designed to do, right? And if you don't have competition in markets, you get too much power concentrated, you get all kinds of funny business of people trying to hang on to economic rents, and that guess what? The negative feedback loops don't work anymore, right? Truth in advertising laws is another classic example that are important in markets to keep them doing what they're supposed to do. Pollution taxes is a great example of internalizing the costs so that markets tell the truth, right? It's a very impactful way of getting markets to achieve something through a negative feedback loop, right? Through the power of markets to self-organize. And on the opposite side, removing perverse subsidies that are moving your goal in the wrong direction. I mean, democracy itself is this huge kind of big negative feedback loop system. It's, at least that's what democracy on paper is supposed to be, right? Information in democracies is supposed to be this negative feedback loop, this set of controls and balances. When I think of our constitutions in Canada and our constitution in the US, it's about creating negative feedback loops, right, that keep the system in check. So those are very, very, very powerful leverage points. And the strength of these negative feedback loops relative to the impacts that they are trying to correct against is a very, very powerful leverage point. All right, another one. So I introduced negative feedback loops, which are self-correcting. Positive feedback loops are self-reinforcing, right? So positive feedback loops tend to kind of lead to growth, sometimes exponential growth, tend to lead to explosion, tend to lead to erosion, tend to lead to, if they go unchecked, collapse. So what we want to do with positive feedback loops is we want to control the gain around driving positive feedback loops. So I gave you a classic example for a negative feedback loop, a thermostat. Someone give me a good example of a positive feedback loop. Something that is self-reinforcing. Yes?
Melting of Arctic ice.
Melting of Arctic ice. So describe the dynamics.
Ice melts and reflects less snow because of less ice. And temperature increases and it melts more.
Great example. Great example, right? And then eventually you run out of ice and the positive feedback loop stops, right? So positive feedback loops can never go on forever. There's something that always brings them back into a check. You either collapse the system, so in this case, the ice, right? Or a negative feedback loop kind of brings you back into balance. The flu is another great example. I get sick and I make you sick, and then you make them sick and you make them sick, and right, and then the flu spreads, but it always comes back into balance. Either we run out of people to give the flu to, or we all die, right? So one way or another, a positive feedback loop comes to an end. Population growth, right? If you increase fertility, then there are more couples having babies, therefore there are more babies to have more babies, and those babies have more babies, and so you get a positive feedback loop. Money in the bank. That's why the rich get richer, right? Because they have more money that gains interest, that creates these kind of exponential growth. Soil erosion, climate change, so related to your example. There's lots of positive feedback loops built into climate change that have a lot of us quite worried. So positive feedback loops, the reason that they're a really strong leverage point is that if we control the gain around positive feedback loops, that's even a higher leverage point than sort of strengthening negative feedback loops, strengthening the checks and balances. So if we control the gain around population growth or economic growth, Forrester and Meadow found in their world economic model that the two most influential forces of the model was economic growth and population growth, right? And in terms of economic growth, everyone knows that that's one of the most influential leverage points, but usually we're pushing it in the opposite direction. We want more of it, right? Versus directing it or controlling it or guiding it towards higher purposes, perhaps farther down the list. And I know that's been a theme in this class. It's a theme in ecological economics. Income distribution, more and more is becoming a very, very, very important source of a positive feedback loop, right? The wider the gap gets between the rich and poor, the harder it is for the poor to catch up and the rich to get ahead. And then as that power is concentrated farther, this influences many of the other pieces of the puzzle here. There's more incentive than ever to hang on to that, right? To influence the distribution, and you sort of start to get into a positive feedback loop situation with income distribution, something that economists have studied for a long time. Any questions or things to add to that one? Okay. Next one down the list, number 6, is the structure of information flows. We've been talking a lot about the physical nature of systems, but the structure of information is really important. Who has it and who doesn't, right? Who has the information and who doesn't have the information, and what's done with it. You're often, when you think about information, you're often going to a systems diagram and adding a new loop that wasn't there before. A classic example is the toxic release inventory in the US that was mandated by a law in 1986. And without any new standards, without any new law that said you have to reduce toxics, by making the inventories public, we saw a 40% reduction in toxic releases by 1990, 4 years later, right? That was simply going to the system and adding a new piece of information. And companies were like, well, they didn't want to be on the top 10 list, right? They didn't want to be sort of publicly shamed. And with no new regulations to say you had to reduce, there was a dramatic reduction. Adding a new loop, playing around with the structure of information is often about accountability. Labeling laws, right, are really important triggers or leverage points. Meadows uses the example of if you took all of the manufacturing that needs to intake water or city water supplies, and you put the intake pipe below the outflow pipe from waste producing, that would be an amazing information flow, right? That would really, and often does, clean up water systems completely. I think very often about different shareholder models. So when I get a portion of my paycheck each month that gets put into some retirement account that's then invested on my behalf in some far off distant place, and I just sort of get the quarterly statements and I just want to know how I'm doing, right? That's one piece of information. But if I'm an employee and I own a stock in my company, I'm much closer to the cause and effect of the decisions of that company. That's another kind of information loop, right? or if I'm a community member, community-owned companies, right, where the community owns shares in a local company. That's even yet another level of information, right? One would sort of influence employee relations, the other might influence community relations. These are really important structures of information and systems that can be hugely, hugely impactful. I think about the growth of employee-owned companies in Vermont and the impact that's made on this sort of social responsible business management in Vermont. And it's been largely due to the structure of the ownership. Another huge, huge change that we've seen in recent years as wealth has been put in the hands of fewer and fewer and fewer people in industrialized societies. That has really changed. That's been a kind of change in the rules of the game that has led to a positive feedback loop because of the structure of that ownership. Farther down the list, number 5. Now these are getting into things, of course, that influence the parameters, the buffers, the structure, the length of delays, the negative feedback loops, the positive feedback loops, the information flows. All of these are influenced, and that's why it's farther down the list, by the rules of the system. Okay, the rules of the system. The rules define the scope, the boundaries, the degrees of freedom within a system, right? I don't know, the 10 Commandments, right, is a set of rules that have defined whole entire systems, whole countries. The Constitution is a set of rules that creates something like free speech that makes this possible, this possible, this possible. Without free speech, these other less impactful leverage points aren't even possible. Contract laws in general. Contract law, property law makes this one, we talked about markets as a negative feedback loop, as a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Property law makes that possible, right? You don't have markets without rules of the game. You don't have free markets without governance. We often hear in the press this sort of either or, right? You either have markets or you have government. It's just a stupid false dichotomy, right? You have to have really strong governments in order for free markets to do what they were designed to do. There are physical rules like thermodynamics, and you've heard in ecological economics, it's a different kind of way of thinking about the economy, an economy that has to sort of abide by and obey the first and second laws of thermodynamics. And there are social rules that are way more pliable and bendable and transformable and can change quite rapidly, whereas the physical rules don't change at all. Power over the rules, of course, is a huge leverage point, right? And that's why you see so many lobbyists in our state and national capitals, right? Because the power over the rules is a huge, huge, huge leverage point in complex social ecological systems. Thinking to the example that Meadow gives at the beginning of this article of how she was at this meeting about NAFTA and WTO and GATT and sort of has this epiphany of thinking about this list of leverage points. I mean, the WTO is the discussions within the WTO are closed to the press. That really dramatically affects, that rule dramatically affects the structure of information in particular, and therefore the public's ability to react to change, move to different systems of governance. Number four. This one's interesting. We talked about self-regulating feedback loops and the ability of feedback loops like markets to sort of self-regulate. So number 4 is very much about that self-regulation. It's the power, I'll write the whole one out here, the power to add, change, evolve, or self-organize. System structure. The power to add, change, evolve, or self-organize system structure. So in life systems, which of course you're learning in this class that economies are part of life systems, not separate from, biological evolution, right, is the kind of core to self-organization. Technological advance within market systems is the core to self-organization. Social revolution and giving the space for revolution to happen, right? The power to add, change, evolve, or self-organize is core to this leverage point of self-organization. When you limit evolutionary processes, for example, by getting rid of the diversity of systems, whether it's biological diversity, cultural diversity, or otherwise, you limit the ability of the system to change, evolve, self-organize, and you very often limit the resilience of the system itself, right, to adapt to change. Therefore, it's a very, very, very powerful leverage point, is to allow that system the freedom to change and self-organize, which means you need both the evolutionary raw material. So in biological systems, we call that biodiversity. In social systems, we often call that cultural diversity. And you need the means for experimentation, right? We need to let these sort of selective processes unfold. It can lead to more resilient systems, but it also means a fundamental loss of control. So it's the kind of leverage point that, again, that's really powerful, but it's a scary leverage point, right? Like if you really sort of unleash the power of the free market, like sometimes it's sort of be careful what you wish for, right? Nevertheless, it's a really powerful leverage point. But not as powerful as the third one, which can put limits on this, or can help direct the power of self-organization in a goal-oriented way. Because the third one is the goal of the system. Or I should say goals of the system. Farther down the leverage list here, right? The goals of the system, of course, are going to influence everything else that we're talking about up the list. Meadows uses the example of genetic engineering. And she says, well, I'm not going to pass judgment on genetic engineering, but I would say that genetic engineering, the outcomes of genetic engineering, very much depends on the goal of the system. If genetic engineering is tied to a profit motive, that is very different goal, right, than something else. So what is the goal and whose goal is it will dramatically influence everything else higher up the chain here of these leverage points. The goal of the system, in Vermont, we're one of a few states that passed into law a new way to charter a company. So instead of just chartering as a corporation, and by law, corporations have to maximize shareholder value, we've created a new vehicle called B corporations or benefit corporations, right? Where you can write the charter to expand the notion of what you mean by shareholder value. Shareholder value might mean profits, but it also might mean environmental stewardship and community responsibility and responsibility to your workforce. And so you can write the charter in a way that looks at the role of a corporation. The goal of a corporation is to create value. But if value is just profits, and if value especially is short-term quarterly profits, that's a way different goal system than something like a benefits corporation. Leaders, of course, set goals, right? So the leader of this institution shapes the direction that the institution might take. Leaders of countries. I mean, I think about my own country, and I was born in the 60s, and our sort of iconic president of the 60s was Kennedy. And you've probably heard this famous quote, right? Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That kind of leadership set into a whole range of change in the U.S. that kind of led to Fair Labor Act and environmental policy, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, led to a whole social justice movement and that was very much government in partnership with communities and states and companies and everything else. And then when I was in high school, Reagan came into power. And he said, forget what Kennedy said, my job is to get government out of your lives, right? Out of the family, out of companies. My job is to get government off your back. And it dramatically changed the goal of the system and changed everything else about the system. So it's a the goals of the system, quite intuitively, are very, very, very powerful leverage points. Which leads me to really where you all are in this class. Because a really important, powerful leverage point is the mindset or the paradigm from which the goals emerge. So here I'm really thinking of, Thomas Kuhn kind of paradigm shift. The mindset or the paradigm out of which the system arises, right? Out of which the goals, the structure, the rules, the delays, the parameters, everything else on our list here arises from the paradigm, right? The big unstated assumptions. How do you think the world works? The deepest set of beliefs about how do you think the world works is the paradigm, the belief system. Growth is good. That's a paradigm, right? That will dramatically affect everything else here. Humans are rational. That's a paradigm. Nature is a stock of resources to be converted to human purposes. That's a powerful paradigm. Humans are made in the image of God is a really powerful paradigm, right? Humans sit on the top of the ladder of nature. And evolution, if you believe in evolution, ended with us, like we're the kind of ultimate prize, right? That's a really powerful paradigm. A person can own land. That's a really powerful paradigm. So you see where I hope where I'm getting with this. Those paradigms then change the goals, they change the structure, they change the information, they change the stocks and flows, the parameters, everything else is really influenced by the paradigm. And that's why ecological economics, we spend so much time talking about that pre-analytic vision of ecological economics. The pre-analytic vision, right, of putting the economy, the square, inside the circle, the ecosystem. And really coming with a pre-analytic vision of the economy that obeys the first and second laws of thermodynamics. And embedding those economic systems within cultural social systems, within ecological systems. And coming up with this sort of three-tiered goal set from that paradigm that says you first and foremost better pay attention to sustainable scale. Goal number one, how big should the economy be relative to the sustaining and containing ecosystem? Then you better pay attention to the distribution, the fair distributions of the benefits and burdens of economic cooperation, right? Especially if we can't count on growth to solve all our problems. I mean, that's kind of ultimately what ecological economics says. And third in that order, then we can talk about efficiency and markets and all of these wonderful sort of human-devised instruments that we've created to kind of allocate resources for us. But only after you've constrained ourselves with a conversation about sustainability and fairness. That's what emerges from a different paradigm of putting the square inside the circle instead of the circle inside the square. I mean, you think back to previous paradigm shifts, right? Copernicus or Kepler, one of them two, probably both, said that the Earth is not the center of the universe. That was most people who introduce paradigm shifts often get ostracized or burned at the stake or, thrown into jail. Adam Smith, big paradigm shift, right? This paradigm shift that selfish acts can maximize the common good, right? Individual selfish acts can maximize the common good. Through the invisible hand. That was a paradigm shift, major paradigm shift that brought power away from the merchant class, brought power away from the state and the church, and said this is the vehicle to give power to the individual, right? That was a big deal.
How come no one tried to put him on a stake?
The society was ready. We happened to, at the time, we had this little thing called the American Revolution, right? It's the exact same time, 1776. Right about that time, we discovered concentrated fossil fuels. The timing was perfect. Ducks were lined up in a row. Charles Darwin, who certainly was, in a way, burned at the stake by the church. Evolution by natural selection was a paradigm shift. Albert Einstein, the notion that energy and matter are kind of convertible, equals mc squared. That was a major paradigm shift that really influenced the course of science. The photograph, that first photograph of the Earth from space, that was a huge paradigm shift that fundamentally affected how humans saw themselves. Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, that book in the 1960s, really affected the whole environmental movement. Herman Daly in The Steady State Economy. Maybe it's a paradigm shift that's coming, that's been thought about for a long time. And then the very last one, the number one, is the one that Meadows argues has the most leverage, yet it's the one that's so hard to do, is the power to transcend paradigms. I don't know anyone who's very good at this. Maybe like some monk who meditates on some beautiful horizon and thinks about that no paradigm is true, right? We all have paradigms. I mean, that's what helps us kind of live our lives. But the power to transcend paradigms is this notion of, well, nothing's really, no paradigm is true, and it all will be changing eventually. I struggle with this one. Sort of some kind of mastery over all paradigms too. So when I think about people who write very eloquently about trying to bring to terms, for example, religious thinking with evolutionary biology, it blows my mind to bring these sort of two worldviews together in a consistent way. I mean, some people have tried to do that. That's a mastery over paradigms, right? People who are very good at mastering different paradigms tend to be very good at adaptation, and they're very resilient people who can kind of throw off addictions and live in constant joy, and people who bring down empires, tend to be these transcend different paradigms, and they often tend to be the people who are thrown in jail and burned at the stake and these kinds of things. So this is a very rare quality for people who can really transcend paradigms and pick and choose between paradigms to accomplish things. So that's the Meadows top 12 list from the pieces of the complex systems that all have leverage, from the lowest leverage points to the highest leverage points, to the ones that sort of accept the structure of the system, to ones that start to change the structure of the system, to ones that tend to deal with the material stocks and flows, to the information stocks and flows, to the ones that sort of redesign the whole way that we even think about the systems. I use these all the time when I think about policy design, when I think about leverage within complex social ecological systems, right? How far up the paradigm, or how far up the leverage point list can I get? In my current job as dean of our school, I'm constantly trying to think about the mindset and paradigm that I bring to the job, that my faculty and students and staff bring to the job. We're constantly sort of thinking and rethinking about the goals of the system. We've just finished, for example, a big strategic planning exercise that took us 2 years to get there, but now we've sort of set forth both a goal set and an ability to adapt and change those goals through time that I think will really influence all of this. These tend to be those fuzzier things. These tend to be the things that you might find in humanities departments on campus and social science departments on campus and natural science departments on campus. These are the hardest to do, but when you do them, watch out because the systems change almost at the drop of a hat. It's quite remarkable to see it when it happens. Any questions or things to add to the discussion? Yes, and then yes.
I mean, it's like you've just laid out. It's gradually gets more and more hazy, and then it's sort of like more and more untackleable.
Uh-huh.
But you said, in your own job, you're thinking about these things. To what degree is this breakdown, this really logical breakdown of how to approach, a big system problem? To what degree is this being used in other policy stuff?
Yeah, well, this article that I'm drawing from, I think has been very influential in a number of fields, ecological economics being one of them. Systems dynamic modeling has been very influential, from healthcare to energy to food systems. It's anywhere people are thinking about transitions from the old to the new. I think systems thinking really takes a hold. We've done at the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics that I'm a part of, we use dynamic systems models sometimes as very expert-oriented approaches, sometimes as very participatory, kind of bottom-up approaches. We're able to work with a diverse group of stakeholders, lay out their kind of vision of how they think the system works, provide kind of expert opinion on those, and then get to a more holistic understanding of how the system works, which then gives us the platform, the entry point for these conversations about, okay, you say you want this goal, and the system currently looks like that. This ain't going to get you to this. Where are the changes? Can we make change at these higher states? Well, sometimes the powers that be, won't allow that. And then you look for maybe changes that are at these lower leverage points that eventually knock the blocks in your favor.
And so to what degree, you're talking about the difference between expert or more participatory stuff, like when you actually lay out the systems model, to what degree is that actually like a really quantitative kind of scientific process, or to what degree is it just sort of like a pictorial? Let's just look at this.
So it can be both. And it really depends on the very practical things like the time that you put into it. So we often, participatory modeling process, we often start with just a blackboard or pieces of paper or flip charts, right? And we teach people how to draw the system diagrams. And there's different system archetypes that we teach them, different kinds of ways, different feedback loop structures. And there's a half a dozen or so that occur 90% of the time. And people start to think, oh my God, yeah. So maybe you're working with an organization. So Jay Forrester, people like Peter Senge today, they're consultants in the business world, and they use this kind of systems diagrams as ways to affect change within corporations. And they usually can take their time because corporations have the money to pay these guys and gals to do that kind of work. We use this in research settings, of course. And I've worked in participatory processes that last a week. I've worked in some that last a day. And I've worked in some that last 2 years. When you have 2 years, you can take a fuzzy diagram, you can have multiple workshops, then you can get a team of graduate students and start to build models. We use, for example, Stella, PowerSim. There's computer models that are built on this visual programming technique. To give you a concrete example, right now we have funding from the National Science Foundation in the U.S., and we've partnered with the state of Vermont and a number of nonprofits and for-profits through Vermont's Energy Action Network. And we're working to build a dynamic systems model of the Vermont state energy economy to help the state move towards 90% renewables by 2050. That's our state's comprehensive energy plan, but we have no idea how we're going to get there. Our governor's really good at making plans and not so good at the policies to, to move us there. So we're building a dynamic energy systems model that breaks the economy up into sectors and the energy by types and the import-export mix, and it's the best that we can do. It's a really parameterized model to then start pulling levers and run scenarios and ask lots of what-if questions. And it becomes a big social learning process to help us then design policy. You know, he's done this. He set the goal of the system, 90% renewables by 2050. That's a big, important leverage point, right? Now we're sort of making the changes here that will get us to that goal. Yes?
This is kind of a broad question. I'm not really looking for a specific answer, but I was just wondering if you could share some insight. If we're aware of all these different leverage points, why are our political and decision-making institutions so addicted to number 12?
Because the status quo is the status quo for a reason. They have the power. It's benefiting them, the status quo. So why change, right? And so they make us all feel like we're getting somewhere by tweaking the numbers, by tweaking the parameters. Whereas these things farther down the list, like changing the rules of the system, that means rocking the boat. That means changing the status quo, right? And that is very often comes through the power of self-organization, like social revolutions, right? You don't see big, huge changes in social systems incrementally. Sometimes you do. Sometimes incremental, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, the world's new. Technology's like that, right? You know, I mean, how many of you have a smartphone? You know, like the whole class, right? That was sort of incremental over time, right? You know, my father had a cell phone in the 70s, and it was a big briefcase, and he thought he was so cool. He opened up the briefcase, and he brought up his phone, and he put it in this little thing, and it beeped, beep, 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 beeped, and it was crazy. And then it was, you know, big cell phones like this big. You ever watched like old Miami Vice episodes, and they got like these huge cell phones, you know? And then it was smaller, and then now we got these computers in our pocket, and that's been incremental change, right? That's led to major revolutions. But very often, the kinds of revolutions that happen are quite different. It can happen quick. So leadership changes is a good example. And sometimes we're very hopeful about leadership changes, like the election of Obama, and then we're ultimately disappointed because he's constrained by the status quo system.
You were talking about the B corporation
Mm-hmm.
thing. I hadn't heard of that idea before. Could you talk a little bit about the actual process of how that came to being? I mean, how it actually such a cool idea that is
Sure.
paradigm shift in corporate thinking.
Well, we have in Vermont we have a business network called Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility. It's one of the oldest social responsibility networks in the country. Lots of states have these now, and there's a national social responsibility network now. And it was actually the businesses, these tend to be the businesses with a bit of a conscience that argued for, lobbied for this change in the ability to charter companies with the benefits, with a broader definition of benefits to shareholders. We weren't the first state to do it. I think maybe Maryland was. And then there were some NGOs that were created to push for this. And now a number of states have changed the law so that you can charter a corporation to be a B Corp or a benefits corporation. So it was kind of slow in happening, and then once it happened very quick.
Is this kind of thing happening outside the states at all?
I imagine. I imagine in Europe, but I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure. We teach a sustainable business class every summer at the University of Vermont, and this is a popular topic that one of the sort of leverage points that we talk about of moving towards a more sustainable business model, where your goal is still creating value, but you're really redefining what value is, right? Sometimes people call it the triple bottom line, for example. You know, to stay in business, you need to be profitable, but how much profits is enough? And maybe the goal of business is to stay in business for the very long run versus maximizing quarterly profits and the boom-bust cycle. And So there's a lot of good thinking. And businesses, of course, are very, very, very influential because of their power to self-organize and react quickly and make change that governments can't often do, right? So we need new rules probably to get to a more universal, social responsible B Corp kind of mentality. And of course, many businesses will say, "Oh, we just can't compete. It's multinationals, and it's the whole world is the market now, and we just can't compete." And that's less and less true, especially if you can use this one, structure of information, to tell the story about why pay a higher price for my product than my competitor because I have a more sustainable business model. Other questions or things that this brings up, examples that come to mind? Yeah.
Some would, it's kind of not related to this, but GPI in Vermont,
Mhm.
how did that come to be?
So I'm giving a talk about this tomorrow.
Okay.
If you can come. What time's the talk?
7:00.
7 o'clock.
In LC 301.
And that's going to be the kind of centerpiece for my public lecture on this trip. But yeah, Vermont was the first state to pass into law and a law that basically asks for the creation of a genuine progress indicator as an alternative way of measuring the kind of health of the economy versus gross domestic product, or at the state scale, gross state product. And it took some years to get there, and took the change of leadership and new goals of the system and those kinds of things before this happened. But now we have a new way of measuring the economic performance. It's much, much broader than simply the volume of economic activity. And it takes into account environmental, social, and economic factors. And in the Daly Farley book, in the macroeconomics chapter, they refer to GPI a little bit.
Oh, yeah, we discussed it a lot.
Yeah.
How it criticized GDP all over.
Yeah, so I'll talk more about that tomorrow night. Yeah.
My friend and I were looking at the website yesterday, and just the values put on different things. It was $16,000 for a Bachelor of Arts, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of got underneath his skin. And it was worth a lot more.
Yeah.
But my argument with him was, well, a conservative estimate's better than nothing.
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge with GPI. It's certainly not a silver bullet, and it still very much is tied to the notion of value as monetary value. So lots of people inflate GPI to be kind of a quality of life indicator, and it's not. It's an economic performance indicator, and it's firmly rooted in dollars, and therefore it's comparable to GDP, which is its strength, but that's also its weakness, right? That it's just dollars. And so something like the value of higher education, we're not getting at the market value. We're trying to get at the larger social value, the positive externalities of having an educated public, and how those kinds of values aren't really accounted for when we think about investments in higher education. And of course, higher education is only one piece of the puzzle. There's preschool, and then there's primary, and there's secondary. So it's a very incomplete picture. That indicator in particular, I think, is very incomplete. So it becomes one of these, well, it's a starting point, it's better than nothing, but it also opens you up to all kinds of criticism because you're now trying to account for very often the unaccountable. Yeah. And I think that's the challenge of ecological economics right now, is to what extent do we embrace dollar valuation as a means to an end, right? Or to what extent does dollar valuation become the end itself? And that's dangerous, because I don't think we want to argue for a paradigm where the whole world is all benefits and costs of all transactions, of all the things we do and value and think that are worthy of the good life are put into dollars. So it's again about creating boundaries. And that's why I was drawn early to the Herman Daly view that, it's about the boundary of the economic system, and defining that steady state is ultimately not so much a question for even economics. It's more of a question for science, if you're talking about sustainability, and for philosophy and ethics, if you're talking about fairness. And then the economists can be drawn upon to make sure that we're making very efficient decisions.
Well, I think
Yeah.
the time is up. I just wanted to ask you one question.
Yeah, please.
It's the Kingdom of Bhutan.
Mm-hmm.
I need to ask you about this.
Okay.
It just I read an article about this gross national happiness index that
Mhm.
they've been using, and now they have a new prime minister, and he said enough is enough. We don't need it any longer. We
Yeah.
need to get down and produce something, manufacture something
Mhm.
in this economy.
Right.
So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean it's been an interesting social learning process, I think, and it was very top down, the use of this GNH. They for a long time were a great example of moving towards alternative indicators, but they're not taken seriously, because they're trying to do something new in a world that is very much tied to GDP. I mean, Vermont is in the same boat. I mean, we're always trying to do kind of funky, new age, sort of cutting edge things, and it's like, oh, well, it's just Vermont. It's this tiny little state, It's the same sort of dynamic. Gross National Happiness USA is based in Vermont, so the group that's using those principles to do the same for the U.S. Gross National Happiness, if you don't know, uses more of a primary data collect, like surveying people in 9 different domains of happiness. And so it's much farther down the road of maybe where we should get to for more of a total quality of life estimate. And probably with our iPhones, pretty soon we're just going to have apps, and you wake up in the morning and it sort of says, how happy are you? And you're like, oh. And then we collect all the data you'd ever need to know for, right? So it is this kind of do we even need to do that? And some of this stuff is intuitive. Gross National Happiness lobbied pretty hard for this GPI bill in Vermont. That's a great alternative. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Mhm.
So we'll hear more about the GPI next tomorrow night. You are all invited in LC 301 at 7:00, and we thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It was fun. Thanks.